When we think of medieval castles, our minds often leap to images of grandeur. Turrets piercing the sky, stone halls echoing with feasts and fanfare, and noble families basking by roaring hearths. But behind the romance lies a far more brutal reality. Beneath the flags and tapestries, medieval castles were cold, damp, and unforgiving machines of survival. They were fortresses against both enemies and nature, where every creaking floorboard, smoky kitchen, and frigid corridor held secrets of a hard-fought existence. This story is not one of knights in shining armor, but of sleepless nights on straw beds, communal latrines that emptied into moats, and feasts served with trenchers that doubled as both plate and pest repellent. In this documentary, we peel back the stone walls of history to uncover what it truly meant to survive a single night in a medieval castle. From restless sleep and bitter cold to ghostly shadows and midnight latrine runs. So, before you get too comfortable in your warm bed, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy diving into the forgotten corners of history with us. The night inside a medieval castle began not with comfort, but with resignation. As the last embers of the hearth dimmed, the chill of stone walls crept across rooms like a living thing. While nobles enjoyed slightly more spacious quarters, the experience of sleep, regardless of rank, was marked by discomfort, cold, and communal hardship. The beds themselves were basic at best. Most castle dwellers slept on mattresses stuffed with straw, a material harvested annually and rarely replaced until the next cycle. Over time, these straw mattresses accumulated dust, vermin, and even splinters of thistle, often causing skin irritation or minor infections. Medical texts from the period describe ailments linked to lodging upon old rushes, including rashes and respiratory complaints. Evidence of how even rest could become hazardous. The wealthiest residents might have wooden bed frames adorned with hangings, but these were more symbolic than functional. The tapestries surrounding beds trapped a bit of heat but also moisture, quickly becoming breeding grounds for mildew and insects. Few rooms had fireplaces, and heating was prioritized for communal halls or the Lord's chamber. For the rest, warmth depended on layered clothing, woolen caps, and human proximity. Indeed, sleeping in one's day clothes was not a mark of laziness, it was survival. With no central heating and castle walls functioning more like stone refrigerators than insulation, removing garments at night risked exposure. One 14th century household manual advised servants to keep boots on through the freeze, suggesting that frostbite was not uncommon indoors during winter months. Windows in castles, far from letting in morning light, were narrow slits designed for defense, not illumination. Known as arrow loops or embrasures, they admitted just enough light to silhouette a target outside, but little for practical use within. As a result, castle mornings began in a deep, near-total darkness. There were no alarm clocks in the medieval world. Instead, residents woke to the crowing of roosters, or in more organized households, the dreaded human alarm. A servant tasked with shouting, "Wakey, wakey," through corridors at dawn. According to records from English manorial estates, this job was loathed even by other staff. The unfortunate individual was frequently the youngest page or lowest servant, and his morning cries often earned him more curses than thanks. Even in royal quarters, early mornings lacked gentleness. Cold floors numbed bare feet. Chamber pots needed emptying. Stumbling through a half-lit corridor to relieve oneself became a daily ordeal, and injuries from falls, particularly among older residents, were common enough to merit mention in legal and medical texts. The sounds of sleep were another overlooked hardship. In shared quarters, especially among guards, servants, or soldiers, silence was a rare luxury. The creaking of wooden beams, the distant howls of dogs, the groaning of wind through gaps in stonework, all mixed with the coughs, snores, and shifting bodies of neighbors. Sleep came in fragments, not deep, uninterrupted stretches. Even lords and ladies, despite their elevated position, suffered disruptions. A noble might be roused at any hour by a guard reporting a disturbance, a servant requesting orders, or child crying from night terrors. Diaries from the period record frequent wakefulness, and some chroniclers noted that the Lord did not sleep through the hours, for the castle is not a place of peace. The social hierarchy extended into sleeping arrangements. Lower servants sometimes rested in hallways, kitchen nooks, or even stairwells, using cloaks or sacks of grain as makeshift pillows. In barrack-like dormitories for soldiers or guards, individuals rotated shifts, some resting while others stood watch, their boots never fully dry and their weapons never far from reach. Interestingly, some records hint that daytime naps were a common supplement to poor night sleep. With sunrise and sunset dictating most daily rhythms, peasants and retainers adapted by grabbing rest whenever possible. One monastic rulebook even permitted short sleep after the midday meal, for the mind must not falter before vespers. Yet perhaps the most telling detail lies in how rarely medieval records describe sleep as restful. Instead, sleep was a threshold to be endured, a necessary pause between duties. It was interrupted by nature, interrupted by duty, interrupted by the cold. And so when the castle began to stir, when footsteps echoed through the halls and roosters announced the coming sun, most inhabitants awoke not refreshed but braced. Braced for the next set of demands, morning hygiene, breakfast chores, and the many challenges of surviving another day within those stony walls. Cleanliness, in the modern sense, was a luxury rarely afforded to those living inside medieval castles. Within stone walls that trapped dampness and cold, hygiene was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous, uncomfortable, and often reserved for symbolic rituals rather than daily necessity. The medieval approach to personal care, particularly in the cramped and communal environment of a castle, reveals a world where the boundary between health and hardship was thin, and where even the act of relieving oneself could be an ordeal. Bathing for most castle residents was rare and grueling. Hot water, a modern expectation, was elusive. While the wealthiest lords and ladies might occasionally bathe in tubs filled near a kitchen hearth, for most, the options were buckets of icy water hauled from wells or cisterns. Some castles experimented with rudimentary plumbing systems using lead pipes heated near the cooking fires, but the dangers were steep. Lead poisoning was poorly understood but not unnoticed. In certain chronicles, complaints of the fever of the baths likely allude to such contamination. The result was a stark choice: remain dirty or risk poison. Soap was another obstacle. Common soap, if it could be called that, was an abrasive paste made from wood ash and rendered animal fat. It was pungent, greasy, and hard on the skin. Only the wealthiest could afford imported Castile soap, made from olive oil and often scented with herbs. According to 13th century merchant records, a bar of Castile soap could cost as much as a sheep, a startling price for cleanliness. For most, soap was a communal commodity, used sparingly and often reserved for preparing to meet a visiting lord, attend mass, or celebrate a feast day. Toileting in castles presents a fascinating yet grim view of everyday life. The most infamous solution was the garderobe, a narrow shaft built into the outer wall, doubling as both latrine and, ironically, wardrobe. Clothes were hung near these shafts not for convenience, but for pest control. The overwhelming stench repelled moths and other fabric-eating insects. Waste from garderobes dropped directly into moats, rivers, or stone pits below, making castle exteriors as offensive to the nose as they were imposing to the eye. In times of siege, these same waste channels became both hazard and defense, deterring enemies with their foul contents. Where garderobes were unavailable, chamber pots filled the void. These small ceramic or metal containers were kept under beds or in corners and emptied, often out the window, with a shouted warning: "Gardez l'eau!" Beware the water. This cry, heard across French and English cities alike, gave linguistic birth to the modern phrase "loo." Still, compliance varied. Many castle dwellers, whether out of laziness or urgency, skipped the warning, leading to not a few unfortunate accidents in castle courtyards. Larger castles with many occupants often resorted to communal latrines, simple bench-like structures with holes perched over chutes or pits. These were far from private. In busy hours, especially morning, it was not unusual to queue up shoulder to shoulder with fellow residents, guards, or servants. Dignity was rare. Even kings were not spared the realities of shared defecation. One account from a Bavarian court in the 14th century describes royal audiences held while the king sat on the toilet using the moment to multitask. Hand washing, while recognized as important, particularly before meals, was inconsistently practiced. Basins of water were provided in great halls and kitchens, but soap was rarely involved. Water itself could be suspect. Castle wells, though usually lined in stone and protected from debris, were not immune to contamination, especially given the proximity of waste channels. This fueled the medieval distrust of plain water and contributed to the widespread use of ale, even for children. Despite these challenges, medieval people were not unaware of the consequences of poor hygiene. Skin ailments, lice infestations, and digestive disorders were common enough to be noted in medical texts and religious sermons. Some monasteries maintained relatively strict hygiene routines, with weekly baths and rotating linen garments. But castles focused more on defense and administration, lacked the infrastructure and mindset for regular cleanliness. Interestingly, smells served practical functions. As previously mentioned, hanging clothes near toilets deterred moths. Pungent herbs like rosemary, sage, and lavender were strewn across floors or worn in pouches to mask bodily odors and repel fleas. Herbal manuals often listed these plants not only for their fragrance, but for their ability to calm the stomach or clear the air of bad humors. Still, for most castle inhabitants, the pursuit of cleanliness was a reactive rather than proactive effort. You washed when someone important was visiting. You scoured your hands if your lord caught you with grease-stained fingers. And you dealt with illness when it arrived, not to prevent it, but to survive it. And so, in the heart of Europe's greatest fortresses, personal hygiene remained an unpredictable compromise. A mix of ingenuity, superstition, and resignation. Life moved on despite the smell, the chill, and the ever-present threat of illness. Because in the medieval castle, as in much of life at the time, survival mattered more than comfort, and certainly more than soap. In a medieval castle, food was more than sustenance. It was status, survival, and sometimes spectacle. Nowhere was this more evident than in the first meal of the day. Breakfast in a castle reflected the stark contrast between rank and reality, between the lord's feasting table and the scullion's cold pottage. For the nobility, breakfast could be a quiet but rich affair. Royalty and high-ranking lords began their mornings with fresh baked bread, wheels of cheese, roasted meats left over from the previous day, and fruits, often imported and expensive. Manuscripts from noble households describe dried figs, quince jam, and citrus brought in by merchants. Alongside these delicacies flowed goblets of wine or warm ale, spiced with cloves or cinnamon for both taste and perceived health benefits. But for the majority, servants, squires, guards, kitchen staff, breakfast was a meager bowl of pottage, a watery stew made from whatever scraps remained, wilted greens, root vegetables on the edge of spoilage, and, if lucky, a bit of barley or old bacon rind. Often this morning gruel was flavorless, gray, and barely warm. Still, it was precious fuel for a physically demanding day. Bread, the staple of medieval diet, varied drastically in quality. Lords consumed manchet bread, white, soft, made from finely sifted wheat. This was the most refined bread available, often baked fresh and served warm. Meanwhile, castle staff chewed on maslin or rye bread, dark and dense, made from mixed grains, and occasionally baked days in advance. In some kitchens, bread served another purpose altogether. As trenchers, thick slices used as plates. These trenchers soaked up grease and sauces during meals, then were either thrown to the dogs or handed to the poor, often after several days of hardening into near rock. Castle cookbooks, such as the 14th century form of kurai, reveal both extravagance and ingenuity. Roasted peacock served with gilded feathers or meat pies shaped like animals highlighted elite tastes. Yet behind the scenes, cooks stretched supplies. Without refrigeration, food preservation relied on salt, smoke, and strong stomachs. Fish was packed in barrels of brine. Meats were hung over smoky hearths until cured. When preservation failed, and it often did, meat was masked with spices. Green or slimy poultry might still be served, with cookbooks advising to test it upon the lowly before offering to the Lord. Indeed, a macabre proverb circulated among castle kitchens. If meat offends the nose, tempt the peasant first. Drinks, too, reflected this uneasy coexistence between necessity and hazard. Water, even from castle wells, was often avoided due to contamination by human and animal waste. Waste disposal systems, though innovative in design, frequently emptied into nearby moats or ditches, leaching into groundwater. As a result, nearly everyone, including children, drank ale. This was not the high-alcohol beverage of modern pubs, but small beer, a weak, fermented drink with just enough alcohol to kill bacteria. Castle records show staggering consumption. A medium-sized household could go through over 3,000 pints of ale daily, brewed on site or purchased in barrels. Special ales were brewed for feast days or honored guests, spiced and sweetened for prestige. Dining etiquette was both rigid and revealing. Seating arrangements reinforced hierarchy. To sit above the salt, closer to the Lord and the ceremonial salt cellar, meant you were important. To be placed below the salt marked you as ordinary. These placements were contested. Court documents recount brawls sparked over someone being seated too near the salt, viewed as a claim to undeserved favor. There were no forks. Diners used spoons, knives, and hands. A 13th century guide to table manners advised guests to wipe their fingers on the tablecloth or their sleeve, but never upon the beard, lest it drip thereafter. Shared drinking vessels were common. Double dipping was a known offense but often tolerated among equals. Meals were loud communal events, especially in the Great Hall. Music played, jesters performed, and dishes emerged in a carefully choreographed sequence. A single meal might involve 5 or 6 courses, with pauses for entertainment and announcements. Yet for many in the castle, meals were something to observe rather than enjoy. Scullions and lower staff often ate standing or only after nobles had finished. Their share included scraps, gnawed bones, discarded crusts, or pottage ladled from the bottom of the pot. In times of scarcity, even this was rationed. Castle inventories from harsh winters document servants surviving on a mixture of oat cakes and boiled acorn flour, which turned bitter unless carefully leached. Despite these hardships, food also brought moments of joy. Feast days transformed the castle. Kitchens blazed from dawn to dusk, filling the halls with aromas of cinnamon and roast meat. Dishes arrived shaped like castles, dragons, or boats, sculpted from pastry, marzipan, or colored jellies. These subtleties were more art than food, meant to awe and amuse. A popular design included a pastry knight astride a chicken steed, galloping across a battlefield of breadcrumbs. These spectacles served more than merriment. They reinforced power, generosity, and divine favor. A well-fed household reflected a competent ruler. Even the poorest servant, given a slice of meat on Christmas, partook in this message. In the end, castle cuisine was a world of extremes. Overindulgence beside deprivation, fragrant spices beside spoiled meat, hierarchy reinforced at the breakfast table. It was hunger and hierarchy served together, on trenchers of hard bread. To modern sensibilities, the air inside a medieval castle would have been almost unendurable. Yet for those who called these stone fortresses home, the odors were simply part of life. A pungent blend of human, animal, and architectural byproducts that seeped into every crevice of daily existence. Far from being incidental, these smells tell a vivid story of how medieval people lived, worked, and coped in an environment that was rarely, if ever, truly clean. At the heart of the olfactory assault were the floors, deceptively simple in their construction. Most castle rooms, from great halls to servant quarters, were covered with rushes, bundles of dried grass or straw strewn across the ground to provide insulation and absorb spills. While this practice offered some relief from the cold stone beneath, the rushes were typically replaced only once a year. Over the months, they accumulated a grimy stew of food scraps, animal droppings, grease, urine, and even fragments of broken pottery or bones. Herbs such as lavender, thyme, and sweet flag were sometimes scattered among the rushes, an early attempt at air freshening. But these were more symbolic than effective. Contemporary sources mention a wholesome scent for the nose, but the underlying reality was a floor more compost heap than carpet. Sharing these filthy floors were the animals that roamed freely inside the castle. Dogs, often half wild, wandered among the benches, scavenging for scraps. Cats served a functional purpose, hunting the ubiquitous mice and rats. Chickens pecked around hearths, and in times of poor weather or sieges, even pigs and goats might be sheltered indoors. In one recorded banquet, a nobleman's falcon defecated on the table, drawing no reaction from diners, an event so common it barely warranted mention in chronicles. The walls, though solid and defensible, were not inert. Constructed from limestone or granite, these thick surfaces trapped moisture, especially in colder climates. In the absence of insulation, condensation collected during the night, giving the walls a perpetual clammy feel. To combat this, castles hung tapestries, ornate woven cloths often decorated with hunting scenes or biblical motifs. While they added color and status to otherwise barren rooms, they also absorbed dampness and smells. Over time, these hangings became homes for insects, mildew, and even rodents, as they were rarely removed or cleaned. Kitchens were among the most potent sources of odor. In large castles, multiple fires burned continuously, roasting meats, boiling broths, and baking bread. While the scents might seem pleasant in theory and practice, they mingled with rotting offcuts, spilled ale, and the sweat of overworked cooks. Leftover grease congealed in the cracks of kitchen tables. Fish scales clung to stone basins. Castle kitchens lacked chimneys until the late Middle Ages, so smoke hung low, soaking into garments and lungs alike. The process of food preservation added another layer. Without refrigeration, meats were smoked, salted, or pickled, but spoilage still occurred. Records from castle inventories list meat marked as gray or slack, with some recipes recommending spices to make palatable the flesh past its strength. Vinegar and mustard were employed less for flavor than for masking decay. Outside the kitchen, refuse disposal was rudimentary. Waste from food preparation, table scraps, and dishwashing water was thrown from windows into courtyards or moats. Over time, these accumulated into literal hills of organic matter, known in some documents as middens. During summer, the smell was overwhelming. During rain, it became a slurry that seeped back toward the walls. Yet perhaps the most infamous contributor to castle stench was the garderobe, the castle toilet. These chutes built into outer walls allowed waste to fall into pits, moats, or ditches. In theory, the breeze and running water would carry the smell away. In practice, especially in densely populated castles or during sieges, the air around the base of a castle wall was thick with waste. Amazingly, these toilets sometimes became unexpected allies in defense. In one recorded siege, attackers attempting to scale the walls were overcome by the smell and retreated. Chroniclers called it the stink that turned the tide. Medieval biological warfare was often unintentional, but no less effective. Inside, the cumulative effect of all these factors was an environment saturated with odor. Even luxury was not immune. A noblewoman's chamber filled with perfumed oils and fresh herbs still suffered from damp tapestries and smoke-stained ceilings. Servants beat the hangings with sticks to dislodge insects but rarely wash them. Candles and torches, while providing light, added their own acrid scent, particularly when made from animal tallow. To cope, people developed olfactory defenses. Pomanders, balls filled with scented herbs, were carried on belts around the neck. Religious figures swung censers of frankincense and myrrh, not only for ritual but for cleansing the air. Herbal bundles were burned in sick rooms or tied above cribs. And for the poor, survival came with a simple logic. One did not notice the smell if one had never known anything else. In sum, the medieval castle was not merely a fortress of stone. It was a fortress of smells, each scent a marker of life's struggle. From moldy walls to rush-laden floors, from kitchen waste to falcons at dinner, the olfactory world of the castle offers a rarely told history, one not written in stone but inhaled by all who pass through. Though medieval castles are often imagined as romantic relics of chivalry and nobility, their primary purpose was far more pragmatic and brutal. These towering stone fortresses were engineered for survival in times of war and siege. Every corridor, stairwell, and wall served a strategic purpose. To live in a castle was to inhabit a weapon, and to serve in one meant constant preparation for the worst. The castle wall, often exceeding 12 to 20 feet in thickness, was not just a barrier, it was a bulwark of calculated design. Masonry techniques evolved to absorb the shock of battering rams and deflect projectiles. Atop the walls, parapets and crenellations offered archers defensive cover while allowing return fire. Narrow openings known as arrow slits or loopholes were carved into the stone, wide on the inside and narrow outside. This design allowed archers inside the castle to shift aim without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Yet these slits were far from comfortable. Training to shoot through them required precision and familiarity. Chroniclers describe castle archers practicing daily, even firing at straw dummies set beyond the moat. One humorous account from a Welsh castle notes a frustrated guard accidentally shooting his arrow into a latrine shaft instead of the practice dummy, a reminder that even deadly defenses came with absurd mishaps. Within the gatehouse, the most vulnerable point, lay one of the castle's most feared innovations, the murder hole. Built into the ceiling of narrow passageways, these holes allowed defenders to pour boiling water, burning oil, or even beehives onto invaders below. The beehive tactic, rarely mentioned in textbooks, appears in several siege reports. The chaos of swarming bees inside armor was so disruptive that one besieging force at Montségur retreated entirely after such an attack. Moats, often thought of as romantic water features, were functional and adaptable. Though not always filled with water, they served as obstacles, trapping siege towers, exposing soldiers to arrow fire, and, in many cases, collecting waste. Some moats were engineered to flood and drain rapidly. A few castles even used sluice gates, which could be opened to wash away debris or invaders. Drawbridges, meanwhile, could malfunction spectacularly. Operated by pulleys and counterweights, they were crucial to daily traffic and emergency defense. Castle records recount incidents of drawbridges being dropped too early, too late, or on unintended guests. In one memorable case from 13th century Wales, a cow was stranded mid-drawbridge for 3 days, blocking both foot soldiers and carts while guards argued over whose responsibility it was to move her. Inside the castle, architecture favored the defender. Spiral staircases, almost universally built in a clockwise direction, gave right-handed defenders the advantage. As attackers ascended, Their sword arm was restricted by the central column, while the defender had a clear downward arc. Steps were intentionally uneven in height and depth, designed to trip unfamiliar feet. Many castles also incorporated false doors, dead-end passageways, and even trapdoors leading to oubliettes, narrow, windowless prison pits. But fortifications were only as strong as the people who manned them. Training was relentless, especially for guards and squires. Archery drills occurred in the early morning. Swordplay in courtyards was routine. Guards were tested not only on marksmanship, but on watchfulness. Falling asleep on duty could result in public punishment or demotion. Some castles required guards to sing or whistle during their patrols, not for entertainment, but as proof they were awake. One complaint from a French castle lord labeled a guard's off-key humming an auditory siege upon the ear. Castles also prepared for long sieges, which could stretch for weeks or even months. Stockpiling was a year-round task. Castle inventories from the 14th century list enormous stores of grain, salted meats, fish, dried beans, and ale. A medium-sized stronghold might store 200 barrels of dried cod, 500 bundles of arrows, and dozens of crossbows. But not all provisions were practical. One ledger, likely maintained by a seneschal with a sense of humor, lists 3 balls for juggling alongside axes and catapult bolts, perhaps a nod to the need for morale and isolation. Weaponry was maintained by the blacksmith, an essential figure in castle life. Not only did he repair swords and armor, he also forged hinges, locks, cooking pots, and horseshoes. Some lords demanded ornamental flourishes on everything from gate spikes to dragon-headed door handles. One blacksmith, according to local legend, broke 3 anvils in protest after being asked to engrave poetry on a privy latch. In times of war, knights and squires served as frontline defenders. But even in peacetime, their work was demanding. Knights trained in the use of lance, mace, and shield. Squires polished their armor, cared for horses, and learned tactics. Training often occurred in brutal conditions, rain, snow, or darkness, to simulate siege realities. Injuries were common, as were rivalries. Jousting contests occasionally spilled over into real violence, and some castles banned practice tournaments after a particularly bloody season. Perhaps the most overlooked figures in castle defense were the ladies of the castle, who assumed command in the lord's absence. Far from idle nobles, they managed supply chains, directed repairs, and in some cases led garrison forces. During a 15th century siege in northern France, Lady Jeanne de Penthièvre coordinated the defense of her castle for 4 weeks, outlasting the attackers by rationing grain and launching flaming tar barrels over the battlements. Defense, in short, was not an emergency response. It was a way of life. From architectural nuance to rigorous training, the medieval castle was a living organism built to withstand both war and time. And every creaking drawbridge, every practice arrow, every worn stone step carried the imprint of lives prepared endlessly for conflict. Amid the cold stone walls, laborious routines, and the ever-looming specter of conflict, medieval castles were not without joy. In fact, entertainment played a crucial role in the rhythm of castle life, not merely as distraction, but as a form of hierarchy, ceremony, and even mental survival. At the pinnacle of medieval spectacle stood the feast. These events, particularly on holy days or visits from dignitaries, were grand performances as much as meals. Food arrived in waves separated by pauses for music, pageantry, or riddles. Central feature of these banquets was the subtlety, an elaborate dish designed not only to feed but to astonish. Popular subtleties included pastry castles filled with live birds, released to fly around the hall, or a marzipan knight riding a roasted chicken fashioned as a horse. These edible illusions celebrated power, wealth, and imagination, and reminded everyone at the table who was in control. Seated nearby, often unmissable, was the jester, a performer who defied the rigid hierarchy of castle life. Equal parts clown, acrobat, and satirist, jesters had the rare license to mock nobles to their faces. Some were simple entertainers, juggling or reciting doggerel verse. Others were astute observers of court politics, using humor to point out contradictions no one else dared mention. A few became so well loved that they earned wages rivaling castle commanders. One chronicler noted that a jester named Roland received his own horse and a golden chain for services rendered to the lord's mood. Music permeated castle life far beyond the feast hall. Traveling minstrels, often accompanied by lutes, flutes, or the curious bladder pipe, crafted from animal organs, brought songs of chivalry, love, and legend. They performed not only at noble gatherings, but also in kitchens, courtyards, and even during long vigils. Music was not mere ornament. It filled the long silences of winter nights and uplifted spirits in times of siege. In some castles, a rotating schedule of musicians was maintained to ensure that every meal, even humble ones, had some melody. Games also offered respite from monotony. Gambling, while officially frowned upon, was wildly popular. Dice games like Hazard or Teetotum were played with reckless abandon among both servants and knights. One story tells of a stable boy who won, and promptly lost, his master's horse in a single game, prompting a furious row that ended with both players in the stocks. Some castles attempted to regulate the chaos, limiting stakes or banning certain games during Lent, but enforcement was lax. Jousting, a more formalized form of play, straddled the line between entertainment and training. While tournaments prepared knights for battle, they also drew crowds, cheers, and wagers. Novelty events became popular over time. Knights jousting blindfolded or riding backwards to prove their skill. Injuries were common. Death, while rare, was never far. Nevertheless, the prestige of winning, even in absurd formats, could elevate a knight's status overnight. Not all recreation was violent or boisterous. The lady of the castle, alongside her attendants, might host more subdued pastimes: storytelling, needlework, or chess. Chess, imported through Moorish Spain, was seen not only as amusement, but as a metaphor for social order. Kings, queens, knights, and pawns, each bound to their own roles. Even children, often overlooked in medieval narratives, had their place in castle entertainment. Young pages and squires played stick fighting, foot races, or crude ball games in courtyards. Toys carved from wood or bone included animal figurines and spinning tops. Festivals like Twelfth Night often reversed roles, servants becoming lords for a day, children allowed to give absurd commands to adults, breaking monotony through sanctioned silliness. Entertainment also served an important psychological function during hardship. During sieges, when food was rationed and death loomed daily, music and storytelling often became essential. Castle logs mention jesters performing nightly during a 5-week siege, using humor to lift morale. One famous example is the culinary ghost tale. Guards claimed the pantry was haunted after hearing late-night clattering, only to discover a tipsy jester raiding the bread store, who later turned the event into a ballad still sung years later. Ultimately, entertainment in medieval castles was more than leisure. It was culture, control, and continuity. Through feast and folly, dance and dice, the people behind stone walls sustained more than just their bodies. They nourished their spirit, celebrated their resilience, and carved moments of humanity into the cold rhythms of fortress life. Beneath every towering wall and battlement, every banquet and defense strategy, medieval castles ran on a quiet force: labor. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals filled specialized roles, creating a human network of coordination and exhaustion. Far from idle relics of chivalry, castles were living machines, and their workforce was the unseen engine that kept them running. A typical castle employed between 50 to 200 staff members depending on its size, wealth, and military importance. These individuals, from kitchen boys to stable masters, formed an invisible society governed by hierarchy, duty, and often grueling routine. In the lowest and least envied tier were the gong farmers, the night workers responsible for cleaning out the garderobes and cesspits. Their work, conducted under cover of darkness, was essential yet stigmatized. Gong farmers were paid surprisingly well, sometimes double the daily wage of a cook, but lived in isolation and were banned from communal areas during meals. Chronicles note that their arrival was often met with muffled coughing and turned backs. Kitchen staff formed the heart of daily activity. The head cook, sometimes nicknamed the Terror of Turnips, oversaw a small army of assistants: scullions, sauce makers, butchers, and boys who turned spits for hours on end. Feeding a castle wasn't a matter of plating dishes. It was a logistical effort requiring careful coordination, especially on feast days when the calorie output per person might exceed 6,000. Some castle kitchens baked bread continuously for 16 hours straight, while others ran on a rotating shift of labor to keep cauldrons boiling without pause. Then came the guards, not only soldiers in times of siege, but also gatekeepers, tower sentries, and internal patrols. Their job was constant presence, standing, observing, and reporting. To prove wakefulness, guards were often required to sing or chant periodically during the night. One English castle had a rule that any guard caught sleeping would lose a month's wage and be forced to clean latrines, a policy that birthed the mocking term snoring night. Interestingly, complaints about guards singing off-key were not uncommon. A steward at Caerphilly Castle once described it as an assault upon the ears no less shocking than the trumpet of doom. Knights and squires held more prestigious positions but were still deeply embedded in the daily machinery. When not fighting or training, knights acted as administrators, overseeing landholdings, presiding over minor disputes, and inspecting barracks. Their squires, typically boys of noble birth and training, performed a wide array of duties, caring for horses, polishing armor, and assisting in ceremonial dress. One squire's letter complains of greasing my lord's sword, only to be scolded for the scent of garlic from my hands. Specialist roles were numerous and surprisingly nuanced. The blacksmith, for example, crafted everything from swords and stirrups to hinges and spoons. Far from the romantic image of a gruff hammer swinger, castle blacksmiths were often burdened by their lord's preferences for embellishment. One Flemish smith, exasperated by a noble's request to forge dragon-shaped door handles, reportedly left the castle entirely only to be coaxed back with an extra shilling per week. Stablemasters, falconers, and messengers added to the chain of function. A falconer's job included training birds for hunting and caring for their diets with surgical precision. Birds were fed tiny portions of rabbit or fish, and their moods were documented in logs. One disgruntled falconer wrote, "Lady Gwendolyn's kestrel refuses the eel again. I suspect she mourns." Whether sincere or sarcastic, the note captures the degree of attention given to even the castle's most elite animals. But perhaps the most overlooked and most powerful job was held by the lady of the castle. In her husband's absence, often frequent due to war, court, or politics, she became CEO, judge, accountant, and diplomat. She managed food storage, supervised staff, oversaw repairs, and maintained household records. Her command extended from the Great Hall to the Dovecote. Historical documents preserve her orders: buying grain during famine, ordering new candles for winter, even resolving staff disputes such as a cook refusing to work with a baker accused of hardening the bread out of spite. In times of crisis, the lady could take up arms. Several accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries describe women leading castle defenses, commanding archers, and rationing food supplies. In one siege, Lady Eleanor of Montfort was credited with holding the gatehouse for 11 days, ordering boiling pitch poured through murder holes while dictating letters to allies with a sleeping child on her lap. Behind every stone rampart stood people, tired, skilled, and utterly indispensable. Their roles were varied, their titles often whimsical, but their labor formed the backbone of medieval life. Whether turning meat in a smoky kitchen, sharpening blades for an unseen threat, or arbitrating quarrels over oats and onions, castle workers upheld not only survival but continuity. A castle was not a monument, it was an organism, and its people were its pulse. In the medieval castle, the line between healing and harm was as thin as the blade of a surgeon's knife. Though more often it was a bone saw, a heated iron, or a poultice of questionable origin, medicine, for those within castle walls, existed in a strange space, part tradition, part experiment, and deeply entangled with religion, astrology, and folklore. For the sick or injured, the first recourse was typically the castle's healer or physician, if one was available. Most castles did not employ a full-time medical professional. Instead, monks, herbalists, or the lady of the castle versed in domestic remedies tended to the ill. Their treatments combined local herbal knowledge with ancient texts like Physica by Hildegard of Bingen, or translations of Galenic medicine passed down through Arab scholars. Headaches, for example, might be treated with powdered emerald, if one could afford it. Vinegar-soaked cloths, or even the powdered skull of a hanged man, thought to carry the soul's departing vitality. For fevers, one remedy advised strapping the plucked rear of a live chicken to the patient's head, under the belief that the fever would transfer from human to bird. Some methods seem laughable now, but others hint at empirical observation. Herbs like garlic, sage, yarrow, and comfrey were widely used, not just for flavor, but for their antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties. Castle gardens often contained small physic plots, where medicinal plants were cultivated under the care of women or monks. Honey and wine, too, were frequently used in wound treatment, both possessing mild antiseptic qualities, though their success was attributed to divine providence rather than microbiology. Surgery, when necessary, was rudimentary and brutal. There was no anesthesia beyond strong ale or numbing with ice. Patients were restrained while bones were set, abscesses lanced, or arrows extracted. Bleeding was common for nearly every ailment, from headaches to melancholy. Physicians believed illness resulted from imbalanced humors. Blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile, and draining blood was thought to restore equilibrium. In one account, a knight was bled at both arms for being too spirited after a successful joust. Despite the lack of understanding, there were surprising glimmers of progress. Fracture splints were crafted from wood and linen. Infected wounds were sometimes packed with moss or soaked wool. The knowledge was there, it just mingled with mysticism. Castle infirmaries might contain jars labeled dragon's blood, a red tree resin, mummy powder, ground remains of Egyptian mummies imported at great cost, and unicorn horn, typically narwhal tusk, believed to neutralize poison. Dentistry was crude but not neglected. Toothaches were common, and treatments ranged from herbal rinses to outright tooth extraction with pliers heated in fire. Some castles had visiting barbers who doubled as surgeons, offering lead fillings for broken teeth, a practice that sometimes caused poisoning. A particularly cautious knight once had all his teeth removed before a campaign to prevent distractions from pain in battle. Astrology also played a role. Medical practitioners frequently consulted star charts to determine the best time to administer medicine or perform surgery. The phase of the moon, the position of Mars, or the alignment of Saturn might dictate whether to bleed a patient or wait. Healing, they believed, was not just in the hands of the healer, but written in the sky. Religion was ever present. Illness was often interpreted as divine punishment for sin or moral failing. Prayers, relics, and pilgrimages were part of many healing regimens. Castles often contained private chapels where the ill sought spiritual intervention. Some patients wore charms, wooden crosses, saint medallions, or bones of martyrs, believed to ward off death or invite miracles. Still, not all were fatalists. The nobility, particularly educated women, maintained notebooks of remedies, recording which herbs helped with labor pains, stomach cramps, or fevers. These collections, passed down through generations, represented a practical, experience-based form of medicine that ran parallel to the formal knowledge of learned physicians. In times of plague or epidemic, panic spread faster than disease. Entire wings of castles were sealed off. Visitors were turned away. Fires were lit to purify the air, and sweet-smelling herbs were burned in corners. Rats, though common, were not yet blamed. The cause of illness remained a mystery, but its impact was deeply felt, both physically and psychologically. Medieval medicine was a mosaic of contradictions, empirical and magical, crude and surprisingly insightful. It offered little certainty, but it reflected the resourcefulness of people who faced constant vulnerability, with no guarantee of cure but with an enduring will to heal. When the sun dipped behind the parapets and the last torch was lit in the great hall, the medieval castle transformed. What was by day a bustling center of command and labor became, by night, a labyrinth of darkness, superstition, and dread. For castle inhabitants, nighttime was not merely the absence of light. It was a realm of uncertainty, populated by creaking floorboards, howling wind, and fears both natural and supernatural. Lighting was limited and costly. Candles made from tallow or beeswax were expensive and carefully rationed. One noblewoman's ledger notes the use of just 4 candles per night, 2 for the chapel, 1 for the ladies' chamber, and 1 shared between the kitchen and passageway. Torches, soaked in resin, provided some illumination but produced thick smoke and a foul odor. Most corridors remained in shadow, their uneven stone floors made treacherous by low visibility. In this twilight world, the night watch came alive. Guards patrolled towers and walkways, tasked with spotting intruders, or at least staying awake. To prove alertness, they were required to call out the hour, ring bells, or even sing. But the job came with hazards beyond fatigue. Many were deeply superstitious, particularly those assigned to haunted areas of the castle, abandoned rooms, unused stairwells, or the crypt. Ghost stories were not mere fireside tales. They were part of the castle's oral record. Guards wrote down sightings and apparition logs, detailing everything from cold spots to figures in outdated clothing. One such entry describes a spirit in a tunic of last century's cut, seemingly offended when unacknowledged. These records, while sometimes tongue-in-cheek, reflect a very real cultural belief in spirits and the lingering presence of the dead. Castle architecture fed the imagination. Shadows cast by torchlight warped into monstrous shapes. The suits of armor displayed in halls, once symbols of prestige, became menacing in the gloom. In one oft-repeated tale, a drunken sentry attacked a suit of armor, mistaking it for a demon. The event became a ballad, performed for years by the castle's jester under the title Sir Gawain and the Tin Ghost. Creatures of the night played their part in stoking fear. Bats nesting in rafters flapped overhead without warning. Mice and rats skittered behind walls, often mistaken for ghosts or spirits. Some bestiaries listed these pests as wall demons or shadow lurkers, giving them an aura of the supernatural. Cats, valued for pest control, were both feared and revered. Their green eyes gleaming in darkness led some to associate them with witchcraft or omens. Reflections, rarely seen clearly by candlelight, further unsettled inhabitants. One knight famously swung his sword at a mirror, believing he'd spotted a silent intruder. The incident, recorded by the castle steward, notes simply, "Sir Edric wounded only glass and his dignity." Despite the unease, people found ways to adapt. Castle routines adjusted for the dangers of darkness. Night cloaks, heavy woolen garments with hoods, were worn to conserve warmth during nocturnal movement. Servants memorized the location of every wall, stair, and alcove. Some tied cords along hallways to guide their path. Others preferred to stay in place entirely, relieving themselves in chamber pots or buckets rather than risk venturing to the guardrobe. For children, and even adults, bedtime prayers and talismans were essential. Small crosses carved into bedposts, pouches of herbs hung above doors, and whispered psalms offered a fragile sense of protection. In some castles, sleeping circles were practiced among guards or squires, with individuals arranged back to back to ensure collective awareness and warmth. The jester, curiously, often played a key role in calming nightly tensions. His stories, songs, and mimicry distracted from fear and lent humor to the unknown. One famous haunting turned out to be the jester stealing midnight snacks from the pantry. When caught, he explained it as possession by a hungry ghost, and the tale became a recurring act during feast nights. Even so, genuine nighttime dangers remained. Accidents in the dark were common. Falls down stairwells, burns from torches, bites from rats. Intruders, though rare, posed real threats during times of conflict. And for the ill, night brought worsening symptoms, colder air, and isolation. A phrase from a 15th century French chronicle captures the sentiment. The castle slept, but no one truly rested. In the silence of the medieval night, fear mingled with imagination. The same stones that stood firm by day whispered uncertainties by moonlight. Shadows stretched, doubt stirred, and every creak of the timber became a question. Night in the castle was not merely a passage of time, it was an ordeal, a test of nerves, a mirror to one's inner fears, where the darkness outside met the darkness within. Below the grand halls, tapestried chambers, and battlements of medieval castles lay their darkest spaces, the dungeons. These cold, cramped, and claustrophobic cells formed the final destination for criminals, enemies, and, more often than not, debtors. In a world ruled by hierarchy and the sword, the dungeon was less about rehabilitation and more about containment, punishment, and political messaging. Contrary to modern myth, not every castle had a dungeon, but those that did use them not only for storage or short-term detainment, but as symbols of absolute authority. Being cast into the depths of a lord's fortress was as much about fear as it was about confinement. Most dungeons were small, no larger than a closet or pantry, with low ceilings, stone walls slick with moisture, and temperatures that hovered around 50-55 degrees Celsius, 10 to 13 degrees Celsius year-round. Ventilation was minimal. Candles, if allowed, barely penetrated the gloom. Chains affixed to the wall or floor were common, not only to prevent escape but to degrade posture and dignity. One 14th century record describes a prisoner shackled for so long that he forgot how to stretch. There were levels of misery. Upper-level cells, sometimes referred to as guest chambers with locked doors, might have small windows and straw bedding, reserved for nobles or politically sensitive captives. Lower cells, often carved into the rock itself or built into unused storage vaults, were little more than pits. In these spaces, rats, mold, and human waste were constant companions. And yet dungeons operated under rules, unspoken and inconsistently applied, but present nonetheless. Prisoners were expected to pay for their food, their bedding, and even their chains. If they lacked funds, they relied on family, servants, or outside donations. Some chroniclers compared dungeons to the worst sort of inn, where you paid for your stay but were never allowed to leave. Debtors made up a significant portion of the castle prison population. One record from a Burgundian stronghold notes a man jailed for failing to pay his barber, who then visited him weekly, both to collect and to offer discounted trims. These absurdities highlight a key fact. Punishment was often less about justice and more about enforcing obedience to social contracts. Special prisoners such as foreign nobles or disgraced knights often brought their own entourage. Servants, scribes, even food tasters accompanied them into confinement. One tale recounts a captured duke whose taster refused to sample another bowl of gruel after a week, citing psychological harm. The Duke, undeterred, began writing poetry about lentils and captivity, some of which survives today. Escapes were rare not only because of the architecture, but because everyone knew everyone. A fugitive knight might be recognized by his coat of arms, gait, or even scent. Still, a few tried. One man disguised himself as a washerwoman, only to be recognized by his mother as he fled through the village. Another dug his way through a pantry wall and was caught halfway through a stolen honeycomb. Then there were the jailers, a peculiar caste of castle worker. Part warden, part clerk, part innkeeper. They managed complaints ranging from too many fleas to insufficient straw. One French jailer earned notoriety for running dungeon tours for visiting nobles, selling chipped pieces of wall as souvenirs. When a prisoner caught him chiseling away more stone to keep up with demand, the jailer defended himself. The stones complained less than the guests. For some, dungeon life became unexpectedly structured. Inmates developed pecking orders, shared resources, and passed time through song, carving, or storytelling. A well-known prisoner ballad, Chains of Iron, Bread of Stone, was reportedly composed during a winter lockdown and sung later by wandering minstrels. Yet despite the dark humor and moments of humanity, the dungeon was a tool of psychological warfare. The knowledge that such a space existed, beneath one's feet, always cold, always waiting, reinforced a castle lord's dominance. It was not meant to house the many, but to intimidate all. And it worked. One noblewoman's memoir describes the silence that fell when a servant was threatened with the lower stairs. No one asked for clarification. Everyone understood. In the end, the dungeon reminds us that castles were not only palaces or fortresses, they were microcosms of power, with every chamber, hallway, and stair serving a purpose. Above feast, command, and pageantry. Below, damp stone and the unspoken threat of being forgotten. Life inside a medieval castle was a study in contrasts. Stone grandeur veiling discomfort, duty balanced by fear, and fleeting moments of joy woven through cold, sleepless nights. From straw-filled mattresses that pricked skin to chamber pots hurled from windows, every detail reveals a world shaped by survival more than splendor. People endured not only physical hardship, but a relentless negotiation with their environment. Through smell, superstition, labor, and laughter, they played music in smoky halls, cracked jokes beside latrines, and slept with one eye open beneath damp walls and creaking beams. And through it all, they kept the castle alive, not just as a fortress of war, but as a fragile, breathing community. Today, when we wander the ruins or admire their silhouettes against the sky, we might pause, not to romanticize, but to remember those who endured within them. Because castles were not built to be beautiful. They were built to withstand. And so were the people who lived there. If this story gave you a new glimpse into the reality of medieval life, let us know in the comments. And if you'd like to explore more forgotten corners of history, consider subscribing. There's always more behind the stone.